Please check your firearms at this point.
Does it say that really?
I always cared at least a little bit about everything. And something just snapped in my head and I didn't give a shit about anything.
I'm interested in the customer service position.
Yeah, I made a mistake, but it's not gonna happen again. Maybe something else might happen, but not that one.
I need some work experience, so I'm willing to do just about anything, not too degrading, but I do something to get me back into the workforce.
Good morning. Good morning. What's the latest and the greatest?
I would never think to try a job training program. I know how to work.
Say I don't want to go. Say you don't want to go. Say you don't want to go. Say you don't want to go. Sit your ass down.
If you don't come here because you truly want to change your life, it's not going to work.
I am worthy of the best that life has to offer. I don't care how many mistakes I made.
It's hard. It's hard as hell. But if we know that, who in the hell want to do it by their damn self?
Anything that is worth obtaining takes hard work, and this is the work. I mean, I feel good about today. So, I don't know.
All we're doing is selling hope. I can't get you to the next step. I cannot feed that little glimmer of hope that got you to get up out the bed in the first place. Without hope, there's nothing.
Lift me up, lift me up, lift me up, lift me up.
Turn your head back and say it again. I am worthy of the best that life has to offer.
I know you love me.
So, as I hope you've seen, the Road Up follows 4 participants in CARA in a Chicago job training program as they are searching for stable employment and a pathway out of poverty. In each case, they took their experience, often learned from the hardships of daily life, and they applied it to finding and keeping, keyword, a job. So today, we are excited to be joined by Greg Jacobs, co-director of the Road Up, and Sarah Wassertill, the managing director of expansion and integration at the CARA Collective, to discuss the film and the steps manufacturers can take to increase employee life cycle. So Greg and Sarah, if you'll join me.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you for the amazing work that you are both doing. I think we would all say the documentary is inspiring, but the work that you're doing at CARA is amazing and so important to what we are doing. I wanted to ask, on the surface, the Road Up is about the participants in this job training program, right? But if somebody's going to say, what is the movie really about? What would your answer be? How would it be different if I wouldn't say a job training program?
We started this around 2014, and I think we finally got an answer to that around 2020 when we finished it. We actually had a list on our whiteboard at one point of something like 20 or 25 things that it could possibly be about. Issues that we thought, this is what the movie's really about. Is it about homelessness? Is it about incarceration, addiction, poverty, segregation, all the things that kind of go into it, all the issues or causes that brought the people to CARA in the first place. And I think it was only when we had essentially finished the film that we kind of hit on an explanation. And to us, the film is really about the barriers that millions of Americans face, whether they're small or large, whether they're internal or external, whether they're individual or systemic, that prevent them from getting and keeping a job. And it's like, suddenly, once we figured that out, it all became very clear. That's what the movie's about, because that encompasses so many of the other issues that the film speaks to. And one of the things that I think coming up with that answer allowed us to do was then figure out how the film can be used. So it's sort of, what is the movie about? And then what can it do? And I think one of the things that's so exciting about this and why it's such an honor and thrill for us to be here is that we are trying to put the film to use as a tool for organizations and companies to have these conversations, about these issues that are often very challenging and divisive and not always intuitive to people. And the film can provide a space that sort of softens the discussion a little bit, and maybe fills in a little bit more of the why and some of the things that you've been talking about this morning and this afternoon. And then the wonderful thing is we're working very closely with Kara, and they can fill in the how, and it works really nicely.
So that's one of the things that I pulled out of it is when we talk about diversity and inclusion, diversity makes a lot of logical sense. It's numbers, it's people, it's individuals. The inclusion piece gets a little bit trickier, right? That is bringing your whole self to work. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about this film is it showed their whole selves and some of the challenges that they were facing. One of the things that Jesse said is, this isn't about a job. And so I want to pull on that thread a little bit because he basically says a job is necessary, but not sufficient in what they're doing and what the people that are coming to Kara are through. So pulling on that a little bit, if it's not about a job, what is it about?
Well, so I think Jesse sees the people who come into Kara are often at a certain low point in a vicious cycle. And in many cases, the job was an intensifier of that cycle or, something that accelerated the cycle, but it may have been the cause of it, but maybe not. It could have been, as in Jesse's case, a broken relationship. It could have been addiction. It could have been, in Clarence's case, incarceration. It could have been any of a number of things. So the job is kind of part of that cycle, but it's not the whole thing. So to expect the job to then put you into a virtuous cycle and be solely responsible for everything turning out okay is kind of crazy. And that's what Jesse will say all the time. You can't expect a Tamala who has spent 25 years not having a job to suddenly get a job, know how to do the checkbook, know how to do all the sort of rudiments of getting to work every day and the culture of work and all of that. That's just not going to happen. So I think for Kara and for what Jesse is doing in Transformations, a lot of it is about all the other elements that will accelerate the virtuous cycle in addition to the job. So it's understanding the culture of work. It's deepening your bench, as Kara often likes to say, so that you have family or community or connection so that when things don't go so well, the virtuous cycle can continue. So I think in that sense, the job is necessary. It's necessary for self-confidence and well-being and financial stability and all of that. But there's so much else that goes into then what you need to do to keep that job. That's the sort of package that Kara is trying to push through all the time.
So the film is for individuals, right? It's 4 faces that we're following throughout. But to the point, there are millions of people, right? The barriers that you were just discussing, there are a million people who are locked out of the workforce due to a variety of barriers. So Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what steps can the manufacturers take in an employee's life cycle to overcome those barriers, to find those overlooked talent?
Absolutely. So as Greg just talked about, at Kara, we are focusing so much on the whole person. And so we think a lot about empathy. My team comes at it from a little bit more of a scientific approach because we thought we've moved people into roughly 12,000 jobs at 70% same firm retention rates. What's actually happening? What can employers do to access that talent? And when we looked at that through a scientific lens, we identified 5 different levers that employers can pull, not just to access that talent, but retain and grow them. So number 1, that's on the sourcing piece. So how do you not just find that talent, but create the opportunities? That includes the requirements you have, the language that you use, and where you source. Second, we look at the hiring process. So the selection process for everything from reducing bias in the hiring process all the way to skills-based hiring. Third, we look at job quality, support, and culture, because we also know that getting someone in the job is just the first step. If you can't keep them, it doesn't really matter. We know that there's been a lot of talk about wages and benefits right now, but there's also other things, as you all know so well, which is what does the support look like from the manager? What is the culture? And what are the opportunities for support, especially for people who might come from experiences where they've had trauma? Fourth, we look at upward mobility. So career pathing and upskilling is a hot topic right now, but if people don't know about the career pathing and actually have a pathway to get there, it doesn't really matter. So we think a lot about advancement. And then lastly, we think about public positioning. I suspect that many of you here have someone in your company who thinks a lot about risk and says, we can't hire this population or that population because it's just too risky. And so we talk about public positioning because the best way to reduce risk is to hear about other companies that are doing it. And so we always encourage companies that if you're shifting practices and you're seeing success there, shout it from the rooftops, because that's going to be the way that you can get other employers to follow suit and increase those opportunities for others in your community as well.
I love that. And it's one of the things that I think we talk about all the time is, I love that that's number 5. So that we have steps 1 through 4 are the tangible actions that we should be employing. And then, by the way, tell everybody else what you're doing. I do love that. Okay, so race is not mentioned really in the film at all, I don't think. But there's this constant intersection of race, poverty, homelessness, all of this kind of tied together throughout the film. And in fact, right, 80% of CARA participants are people of color.
90%.
90%. I was off. So what are the structural and the historical, what are the barriers that they're facing that we can try to overcome and implement?
Yeah, and I mean, I think even more specifically, I think 80% of the CARA participants are Black. I think that may be the number. So Chicago, like so many other cities, has a history of segregation that goes back, generations, hundreds of years, 150 years at least. And so what I think the population that CARA gets kind of reflects is, first these, many, many, many decades of explicitly racist social policies, real estate restrictive covenants, banking redlining, restrictions and constraints in the way federal money was being spent, all of that, that essentially precluded wealth creation and intergenerational wealth creation, and also opportunity. So, and created in Chicago a very, very segregated city. There was a point, in the 50s or 60s or 70s where there may have been, when some of those barriers started to fall, but then other supports were kicked out from beneath people in other ways. So, the jobs being outsourced and jobs moving to the suburbs, or jobs not coming to mostly Black neighborhoods. So I think the result is that in Chicago, you have probably, technically, there may be less segregation now, but the segregation that does exist is probably more hyper-segregation and more hyper-impoverished too. So the poverty is deeper. And that's not everybody who comes to CARA by any means. But I think what you see is in someone like Clarence's life is constraints that have been there from birth, that have made it at each level incrementally harder for him to have gotten to the point where he would enter the workforce without, existing significant barriers. And we didn't go into Clarence's specific story, but, it is a story of a small mistake, justice involvement, and then the spiral that goes from there. So I think that's those are the constraints that people are working on. And one of the things that fascinated me about CARA is the way that what Jesse does takes these massive systemic factors into account, but then acknowledges that racism, segregation, housing discrimination, these things aren't going to be solved by tomorrow morning when you have to get to work. So how do we then deal simultaneously with give the individuals the tools that maybe they haven't been acquired over the years or have lost over time? How do we give them the tools to then start the process of joining the economic mainstream as we're also doing the necessary work to fight these other things? And I think the fact that what he does bridges what is the political divide of the last 60 years was totally fascinating to us. It's such common sense. Like, of course it's systemic, and of course it's individual. But we tend to view things as if you say one way, you're blaming the victim. If you say it the other way, you're, excusing personal responsibility or whatever. So to me, it was like there's a solution somewhere in Jesse and in the role that he plays, and that was really interesting.
That I like how you tied that to those two divides of political ties. The other thing I would note that you just were talking about is, I think in our world, that division between equality and equity.
Mm-hmm.
So, you talk about Clarence's history of at birth, there were barriers that were placed there. And that's the equitable outcome that we're trying to shift for all and be more inclusive.
Right. And it is not always intuitive to some people, to understand the extra burden and the extra work and the extra pushing that needs to happen in order to bring people to a point of parity of opportunity. And that can be a hard sell, but it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah. So Sarah, how is Kara helping to shift perspectives, is what I'll say, shift perspectives and encourage employers to deepen their DEI strategies?
Yeah. So if I think about some of the comments that Greg just made around structural inequalities, we oftentimes take a very data-oriented approach. So if we think about justice involvement in particular, if you are Black in America, you are 6 times more likely of being incarcerated than if you are white. Or if you're Latinx, 3 times more likely. When you think about how much of the population is then excluded from the workforce, it shifts the conversation with employers of what is the talent that we are missing out on. So what we do with employers is first, we do a few different things. So number one, we work with DEI professionals, executives, and HR professionals to take a really deep dive into their practices. Sometimes it starts with a narrative shift, which oftentimes we'll lead with this film because that's what it will do. But then what we can do is we work with them to showcase other employers that have done the work. We use tactical practices that our job seekers have shown us of here are the things that we've continued to bump into along the way. And then we work with them to build pilots so that they can shift practices in their firms. I think about a manufacturing firm we worked with recently who was constrained, as our friend talked about earlier, with government contracts and with client contracts. So they said, we don't think we can do anything. We worked with them on what they could do, and they're now hiring 100 more people a year because of slight shifts they could make to their entry requirements. So oftentimes you're working with people who are curious about it and they have the will, but they don't have the way. And so we can use those job seeker informed practices and employer practices to kind of move the needle just, bit by bit, employer by employer.
I think what's interesting there is, right, justice involved, right? By shifting slightly to become more inclusive to justice involved, the impacts that you're having across the entire workforce, that as you become more inclusive to any population, you're becoming more inclusive to all, and the positive benefits that you have from that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Kristen, it is Kristen. I'm terrible at names, but it's Kristen and her mom are discussing the challenges that the Black community face, right, in the film. Is that correct? Okay. And they're sitting in her kitchen, the mom's kitchen. They're talking about this, and there's clearly a generational divide. There's that age issue that's popping up. So Kristen kind of says like, oh, well, this is systemic and it's all systemic. And her mom is talking about, no, you have to focus on education and family. And we gave you all these opportunities. And you can see the common everyday conversations that are happening across kitchens across America. But who do you agree with? We talked earlier about this. There is no right. There is no wrong. We have to deal with the system, but we have to deal with the individual. How do you come to an answer in those really everyday kind of conversations?
Yeah, for me, the answer is yes. They're both right. And it is fascinating because Kristen's mom comes from an era where there was this, I think, sense of possibility and hope, that integration was going to break down barriers, that education was the way out. And that is, still suffuses communities. And then Kristen comes from a generation where it's like, no, you're crazy. We're just spinning our wheels. Education is just going to put you in debt, and it's not going to get you the kind of work that you need anyway. We're being incarcerated. We're being persecuted. And you're naive and crazy to think that these sort of hopeful, wishful things will happen. And what she sees in her world That is an absolutely accurate reflection. And, you know, there has to be an acknowledgement that both are valid and both are accurate in their way. And I also think one of the things that I love about that conversation is that it reminds people that there is, you know, I always have an issue when people talk about the X community, the Black community, whatever, the Hispanic community, because it's really, really, really hard to define a single community there. There are Black communities, there are Latino communities, but there are differences within them that have always been there and will continue to be there. And so I think, you know, it's a way to sort of remind people that there are common experiences that you have to take into account when you're talking about a population, for example, a demographic, but then that it's always individual and that there are always subgroups within that will think differently, and to sort of that the broad brush, chances are, is going to be a nice tool for the beginning, but once you start to get into the weeds, that was a terrible mixed metaphor. It's not going to help that much. And so that's why, you know, in a sense, we wanted that conversation there because we wanted a conversation that was explicitly about race in the film somewhere, but we also wanted it to represent a multitude of, you know, two different perspectives to remind people that there's no one way that, you know, Black people or, you know, Latinx people or whatever are going to think about any particular issue. And I think that's crucial. I would imagine that's crucial for the work that everybody in here does, that everyone is an individual.
So I think that's right. There's this precipice of the systemic issues, housing, racism, segregation, addiction. But then there's the individual. And I think that was what you really highlighted in the film is the job interview, the dealing with a manager, all of those individual skills that, Kara, I know you guys are working on. I think we call them soft skills, but they're the harder skills. And I think that was said right. Even though they're the soft skills, they're more difficult to attain. So when you talk about skills-based hiring, skills-based promotion, skills-based period, can you explain a little bit more about how should employers be implementing skills-based?
Absolutely. I think you hit it on the head. When we think back to the characters in the film, you look at someone like Tamala, who has, you know, she's been homeless. She hasn't had a job. And so she might wonder who's going to hire me, but we also see the skills that she brings. And it reminds me of one of our participants, Tamika, who was a mother of 5. She was a young mother of 5. And so she had never been in the workforce before, but of course she got 5 kids to school on time with lunch every day. She cleaned her house very well. And yet she still couldn't get a job. And so when she came to Kara, we worked with her and said, okay, well, let's put this on your resume. Now it's the Johnson household. And she got to actually itemize all of the things she was responsible for to get a job, first in housekeeping at a property management firm. But now she's a manager there, because we all know that if you are a single mother of 5, you are a natural leader. And so I bring that up because our hiring processes right now are so focused on, well, what was your previous work history? It's focused on the resume, the work background, when really there are so many different transferable skills that someone can bring to a job to be incredibly successful. So when we focus on that hiring lever, that second one we talked about, we think about how can you actually assess someone for the skills that they have and the potential that they bring, regardless of whether they've worked in a factory, regardless of what they've done, because there's so many different ways to acquire skills. And we are not taught as a society to look at it in that way. And so there's a great article, look it up. It's called Imagine a Hiring Process Without Resumes. It was in the Harvard Business Review. And it's this amazing model that's been pioneered in New York. They don't look at resumes at all. You put your name on a list, and once your name goes on the list, or gets called from the list rather, they call you in, you're hired, no resume, no job, but they invest in your training. Their retention rates are 80+%. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what experience you've had, but because they invest in training instead of in recruitment, they're able to invest in the individual. And it brings not just the company success, but the individual success as well.
I'm going to look that up. That is amazing. I've never heard of it. That's amazing. I think that is one of, and you're echoing things that we've heard throughout the day, right? When we talked about military, we talked about getting rid of some of the typical language that we've had and focusing on skills-based. But I love the idea of no resumes. fairly revolutionary. The other aspect of that is the inclusion piece. And I do want to pull this back to, he does the love exercise, right? Jesse does the love exercise. And it was something that I walked into the film thinking, okay, this is about job training. And then he's doing a love exercise and the mirror exercise and all these things of standing up and saying, I'm worthy. How do we fit that into our job cultures? How do we, why did you include that in this film as part of a job training program? But then B is, how do we fit that into our workplaces as well?
Yeah, I when I think of the love exercise, I sort of break into a panic sweat because I think I don't know how I would do that. So the fact that they all have to do that is just mind-boggling to me. When Jesse talks about the process of transformation, so for people who didn't get a chance to watch the film, Transformations is this kind of boot camp that all the participants in Carat have to go through for the first month, and it's 4 weeks. And there's a very strategic process that it takes people through. And so part of it, the first week, is to get people, as Jesse likes to say, to feel again. Because they're folks, for a lot of whom, feeling things like trust, basic human emotions, have been shut down, or they can be dangerous even in the lives that they've been living. So for week 1, he gets them to feel again. But then he says, once you start to those nerve endings start to come out and you don't know what to do with them, that can be a really dangerous place. So then the processes go, how do you start to control those things? How do you work on impulse control and the harder skills? And then finally, how do you do away with some of the baggage that you've been carrying around this whole time? And I think the idea fundamentally is that a lot of the people will come in saying, I'm in a job training program, just get me the job. Don't put me through this program. I've been through so many programs, just give me a job. And he knows that that's not going to work. So he is trying to do in a month what, parents spend 20 years trying to get their kids to do, or more. And he gets people only so far, but at least he gets them a start, and then Carat kind of provides the hallway that they can perform within over the next year. But I think to talk about love, and to have that as such a crucial ingredient in the thing is really about the importance of connection, for one thing, and the importance of vulnerability. Another skill or trait that is often dangerous for the participants or unheard of. And to realize that you need to make yourself vulnerable, you need to put yourself out there, and that someone will reciprocate positively is such a crucial lesson, and so essential to any workplace success, that kind of feedback, that I think that's what makes that lesson both so powerful and so essential to what Jesse's doing.
All I kept thinking about, how many of you have done the Gallup survey where it's like, do you have a best friend at work? Mm-hmm. That's just what I kept thinking about the entire time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sarah, please.
So I've done the love exercise. It was the scariest thing I've ever had to do in my career, is going through the love exercise with Jesse. But when I think about the love exercise, and I think about, as you called it, the harder skills, talking about love, talking about forgiveness, and I think about how we translate that to the workplace, it's that word that Greg just used, which was connection. So often people leave their jobs because they don't feel supported. No one says, how are you? Or if you're showing up late to work, is it because you don't have a jacket? And so when we think about the love exercise and we think about the vulnerability and the connection and we think about how that translates, I oftentimes think about how that translates to managers and how you might come to someone with a sense of curiosity versus a sense of concern. Because so often, especially with individuals that we serve, they come in because they don't believe in themselves. They don't believe in themselves because they've been incarcerated. They don't believe in themselves because maybe they've been in and out of homelessness, or maybe because their community hasn't told them that they believe in them too. They say, nah, you can't do that. You're never going to be successful. And so when we think about how that translates to a workplace, so often you need someone to believe in you before you can believe in yourself. And so that's what the love exercise does. And that's what we also help to do with employers, to think about, as we think about that manager and we think about that point of connection, how much better would retention be if someone just said, "How are you?" every single day? What do you need? How would that shift the dynamic? Because that if you know someone cares about you, you're a heck of a lot more likely to show up and you're a heck of a lot more likely to ask questions and stay.
Yeah, I have to add something that Cara also does. And Cara is the Gaelic word for friend. So that's a crucial part of the ethos of the place. But there's something also terrifying that they do every day, which is called motivations. And it's the sort of morning ritual, and we don't show it in the film really, but the chairs are sort of set in concentric circles, and there's a theme, and people get up and they talk about something deeply personal that's related to that theme, something, that puts them out there and is vulnerable in front of the whole community. And then the terrifying part, they have to sing. So you start a song. And the incredible thing is it's like a musical trust fall. You start a song and then the whole community comes in and starts singing along with you. And it is, anybody who goes to Cara will tell you that will sell them on it in the first 20 minutes because it's so powerful and so emotional. But you will also spend the entire half hour going, oh God, Stevie Wonder song. No, Earth, Wind & Fire. What am I going to sing? Because it is like, it's a terrifying thought to step out and sing in front of a crowd, but then to watch people kind of swoop in and they got you. It's an incredible metaphor, and it's also just incredibly emotional to watch.
Do you want to know why we do it?
Yes.
Because this is also one of those things, people come for a job training program, and they're like, I'm sorry, what you want? No, I'm not singing. And they do sing. And here's why we do it. Because we all know that the number one fear in America is what? It's not spiders, it's public speaking. But I think it's because they didn't realize that the actual number one fear is singing, right? And so if we get people to speak publicly about something vulnerable, they might go from saying, I can't to like, okay, maybe I can. And if you do that with singing where they're like, heck no, then maybe they can continue to overcome those mental barriers of like, yeah, maybe I could apply for this job, or maybe I could do something I never thought I could do. So it doesn't sound like it's applicable to a job, but it's probably one of the most applicable things we do for the job seeker.
I really do love that the aspects that you focus on, I mean, obviously the technical skills, but that you focus on all of those skills that are so difficult to ascertain from a book. Okay, so my last question, then I'll open it up, is COVID-19. So you finished the film just prior to the pandemic, I believe?
Basically, yeah. I mean, it was essentially done, and then we really finished it about 6 months in, but just tweaks.
Okay, so in our industry, we went from about 450,000 open jobs in manufacturing across the nation to now we're at about 900,000 open jobs. And we're seeing this across the country where we have just skill shortage or talent shortages everywhere. Do you think that the challenges the film that highlights is more urgent, less urgent? How are we impacting when everyone just needs workers now?
For me, at least, from our perspective, the combination of the pandemic and the disparities that it shone a spotlight on, and also the summer of Black Lives Matter protests and the post-George Floyd murder protests, all of that really changed the filter that people saw the film through. So I think in 2019, when unemployment was 4%, and for a lot of people, the issues of race, place, and poverty weren't front and center, even though we were trying to say this is really urgent, it was a harder sell. I think what has happened is that has completely, put this scrim in front of the film now, where a movie about unemployment, racial equity, and poverty, like that's about as 2020, 2021 as it gets. And what has been interesting is it's opened up these opportunities, especially for corporate possibilities, where there are conversations, the interests that we've had have been from companies that now feel an urgency that some of them are already feeling, but some of them feel much more acutely. And some of them weren't feeling at all before this, that a way to start talking about these issues. And it may be that there are executive level people who are all behind it, but maybe the plant managers are not, or the people on the line are not. So how do you maybe provide accelerant or energy behind policies that the top level wants to implement, but maybe the bottom isn't sold yet. So that has been a really, really fascinating change, that the whole way people see the relevancy of the film kind of flipped on its head in the last year.
Anything to add from your?
I think it brings a huge opportunity. If we think about who COVID hit the hardest, it is the people who already had barriers to employment. Homelessness went up, food insecurity went up, and people who might have wanted to work couldn't work because they had to care for younger or older family members. So on the talent supply side, you have people who want to and want to work, but have been prevented from it. And then on the other side, you see a talent supply or a talent shortage. And then we've also seen this much overdue awakening around the murder of George Floyd. And so companies are now more activated and they are being more flexible in their policies. So I see right now as a huge opportunity because there's more resources going to it. And I think companies are finally realizing that they need to shift policies that they didn't think they could shift in the past because they have a business need for it. Because there is a talent shortage right now.
Well, thank you both. Truly, thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.